June 1942. Berlin, Wehrmacht High Command. Oberst Klaus Hartmann held a grainy photograph in his hands, studying the small vehicle with barely concealed amusement. The image, smuggled from an American training camp through a network of informants, showed what appeared to be a child's toy magnified to full size, a stubby, angular vehicle with exposed seats and no doors. Around the conference table, German military intelligence officers leaned forward to examine the photograph, and several chuckled openly. "This," Hartmann announced with the confidence of a man who had seen real military vehicles across 2 world wars, "is what the Americans call their general-purpose vehicle, the Willys Jeep." He pronounced the name with theatrical mockery. "Note the construction, gentlemen. Sheet metal pressed into crude shapes. No armor, no protection from the elements. A wheelbase so short it will overturn on any serious terrain. Our Kübelwagen is superior in every measurable way." The assessment traveled up through Wehrmacht High Command with stamps of approval at every level. German military doctrine, perfected through campaigns across Poland, France, and now deep into Russia, had clear specifications for military vehicles. They required robust engineering, substantial weight for stability, and specialized designs for specialized purposes. The American vehicle violated every principle. It was too light, too simple, too ridiculous to take seriously. What Oberst Hartmann didn't know was that within 30 months, his forces would be drowning in a mechanical flood. By the time German troops surrendered in May 1945, American factories had produced 647,825 of these toy vehicles. They operated on every front, in every condition, performing roles German engineers insisted were impossible. They hauled supplies across African deserts and Italian mountains. They towed artillery through French hedgerows and German forests. They served as ambulances, reconnaissance vehicles, radio stations, and command posts. They became so ubiquitous that captured German soldiers would later testify they believed America must have sent its entire automobile production to Europe. The story of the Jeep is the story of American manufacturing philosophy meeting total war. It's a case study in how democracy's chaos produced a vehicle that totalitarian efficiency couldn't match, and it begins not with military planners, but with a desperate request and an impossible deadline. July 1940, Washington, D.C. War Department. While most Americans still believed their nation could avoid the war consuming Europe, a small group of army officers understood that preparation couldn't wait for declarations. They had watched German blitzkrieg tactics overwhelm Poland and France, and they recognized a critical gap in American military capability: mobility. The Army's existing vehicles were a mismatched collection inherited from the First World War and the Depression. Motorcycles proved too vulnerable. Trucks were too slow and couldn't traverse rough terrain. What the military needed, according to specifications drafted that summer, was something that didn't exist: a lightweight reconnaissance vehicle that could carry a crew of 3, a mounted machine gun, and perform a dozen different roles from communications to cargo transport. The specifications sent to American automobile manufacturers on July 11, 1940, read like a fever dream. The Army wanted a vehicle weighing less than 1/300 pounds that could carry 600 pounds of payload. It needed 4-wheel drive, a fold-down windshield for concealment, and the ability to traverse terrain that would stop conventional vehicles. And the manufacturers had 49 days to submit a working prototype, though the Army would grant some flexibility as reality set in. 49 days. German vehicle development typically required 2 to 3 years from concept to production. The Kübelwagen, which would become Germany's standard light vehicle, underwent extensive testing across multiple years before approval. The American timeline was lunacy. 135 companies received the solicitation. 133 declined or didn't respond. The task was simply impossible. 2 companies accepted. The first was American Bantam Car Company, a tiny manufacturer in Butler, Pennsylvania, that was on the verge of bankruptcy and had nothing to lose. The second was Willys Overland Motors in Toledo, Ohio, which requested additional time the Army refused to grant. A third company, Ford Motor Company, watched from the sidelines, waiting to see if anyone could actually meet the specifications. Karl Probst, a freelance automotive designer, received a phone call on July 17th from Bantam asking if he could design a military vehicle in 5 days. Not build one, design one, complete blueprints for a vehicle that didn't exist. He said yes. What happened next would determine not just whether America could field an effective reconnaissance vehicle, but whether American industry could adapt quickly enough to meet the demands of mechanized warfare. And in a basement in Berlin, German intelligence officers were still laughing at those first photographs, confident that American industrial improvisation would produce nothing of military value. They were calculating how long it would take for the Americans to realize their mistake. The mathematics seemed inescapable. Complex military equipment required time, expertise, and rigid engineering discipline, all things the chaotic American approach lacked. Within 4 years, those same officers would be requesting Jeep transport after their own vehicles broke down. September 23, 1940, Camp Holabird, Maryland. Karl Probst's prototype rolled onto the Army testing grounds 74 days after the solicitation went out. The deadline extended as reality forced compromise with ambition. The Bantam team had worked around the clock, sleeping in the factory, solving problems in real time. The vehicle they produced weighed well over the 1,300-pound target specification. The Army didn't reject it, they tested it. For 3 days, Army evaluators subjected the prototype to conditions designed to expose fatal flaws. They drove it through streams and over embankments. They loaded it with twice the specified payload. They ran it continuously for hours, waiting for mechanical failure. On the 3rd day, they ordered the driver to attempt a 45-degree hillside that conventional vehicles couldn't climb. The Jeep climbed it, then descended it in reverse. Major Robert G. Howie, who conducted the tests, filed a report that read less like a technical evaluation and more like a conversion testimony. The vehicle exceeded requirements in every meaningful category except weight. It demonstrated capabilities the Army hadn't known to request. Its short wheelbase, which German analysts mocked as a liability, allowed it to turn in spaces where larger vehicles became trapped. Its simplicity meant repairs could be performed by soldiers with basic tools rather than specialized mechanics. But there was a problem. Bantam was too small to manufacture these vehicles at scale. The company's entire production capacity was 2,000 vehicles annually. The Army needed thousands immediately and tens of thousands more if war came. So the Army did something that would have been impossible under totalitarian military procurement. They gave Bantam's blueprints to Willys and Ford. All 3 companies would compete to produce the best version, with the winner receiving the primary contract. The losers' innovations would be shared with the winners. This was industrial heresy. In Germany, military contracts went to established firms through years-long relationships and careful political connections. The sharing of proprietary designs between competitors was unthinkable. But America was approaching manufacturing as an ecosystem rather than a hierarchy. Willys engineer Delmar Barney Roos studied the Bantam design and made a critical modification. He reduced weight by incorporating a more powerful but lighter engine, the Go Devil 4-cylinder that produced 60 horsepower. This gave the vehicle a power-to-weight ratio that allowed it to perform tasks German engineers insisted would require vehicles twice its size. Ford studied both designs and focused on manufacturing simplicity. Their engineers reduced the number of unique parts and designed components that could be produced on high-speed assembly lines. A Ford Jeep could be manufactured in less time than it took German workers to assemble a Kübelwagen's more complex suspension system. By spring 1941, all 3 companies were producing pre-production models. The Army tested them side by side, picking the best features from each. Willys had the best engine, Ford had the most efficient manufacturing approach, Bantam had pioneered the overall design. In November 1941, the Army awarded the primary contract to Willys, with Ford receiving a secondary contract to help meet demand. Bantam, the company that had created the vehicle and saved itself from bankruptcy, received only a small production run before being relegated to producing trailers. This wasn't fair, it wasn't orderly, it was exactly the kind of chaotic, results-focused pragmatism that German military bureaucracy couldn't replicate. And production was about to scale in ways that would reshape the global war. December 7, 1941, Toledo, Ohio. When news of Pearl Harbor reached the Willys Overland factory, the company was producing 150 Jeeps per day. By the end of December, that number had doubled. By March 1942, it doubled again. Ford's Michigan plant came fully online in February, adding another 300 units daily. The production numbers told a story German planners couldn't comprehend. In 1942, American factories delivered over 100,000 Jeeps. In 1943, production continued to climb. By 1944, the peak year, factories produced well over 250,000 Jeeps, more than 700 per day, every single day for 12 months. But these numbers require context. Germany's total production of Kübelwagens across the entire war was approximately 50,000 units. America was producing that many Jeeps every 10 weeks at peak capacity. The workforce making this possible looked nothing like German expectations of military manufacturing. At Ford and Willys plants, women comprised significant portions of the workforce by 1943, in some factories approaching half of all workers. Former clerks, teachers, and housewives operated stamping presses and assembly lines. They worked 10-hour shifts, 6 days a week, driven by personal stakes in the war's outcome. At the Willys plant in Toledo, African-American workers held positions on the assembly line alongside white workers, a level of integration the U.S. military itself wouldn't fully achieve until after the war. Men who had been denied factory work before 1941 because of their race became quality control inspectors and skilled assemblers. They test drove completed Jeeps, performed precision work, and proved that capability had nothing to do with the color of one's skin. The production process refined itself continuously. Engineers discovered that certain components failed under extreme conditions and redesigned them rapidly. When early Jeeps in North Africa experienced engine overheating, engineers worked around the clock to develop solutions, and modified components began flowing to depots within weeks. German military bureaucracy required formal approval processes that took months for minor modifications. By mid-1943, the Jeep's design had been standardized across both manufacturers. Parts were interchangeable. A broken Ford Jeep could be repaired with Willys parts. Maintenance manuals were simple enough that soldiers with 8th-grade educations could perform major repairs. The vehicle's modularity meant that field modifications became commonplace. Soldiers welded armor plates for protection. They mounted everything from stretchers to 50-caliber machine guns to communications equipment. In German intelligence assessments from this period, analysts noted the Jeep's proliferation but dismissed its significance. These were still seen as auxiliary vehicles incapable of performing real military work. The Wehrmacht relied on specialized vehicles, reconnaissance cars for scouting, half-tracks for infantry transport, trucks for supplies. The idea that a single lightweight vehicle could perform all these roles seemed to violate basic engineering logic. What German analysts missed was that the Jeep's versatility made logistics simpler. A single vehicle type meant single spare parts inventories. Mechanics trained on one model could repair any Jeep. Fuel and maintenance requirements were standardized. While Germany deployed dozens of vehicle types requiring different parts, training, and support, America deployed one vehicle that could do anything, and soldiers were about to prove just how much that vehicle could endure. November 1942, Tunisia, North Africa. General Major Hans-Jürgen von Arnim watched through field glasses as American forces moved across the desert floor. What caught his attention wasn't the tanks or infantry formations. Those followed predictable patterns. What disturbed him was the sheer number of small vehicles darting between positions, carrying supplies, towing artillery, evacuating wounded. Von Arnim had experience fighting mobile desert warfare. He understood that logistics determined everything in North Africa. His own forces struggled constantly with vehicle breakdowns. The desert consumed machines, sand infiltrated engines, heat warped components. The Afrika Korps maintained a fleet of specialized vehicles and still suffered constant mechanical failures. The American vehicles multiplied. Intelligence reports indicated they were the same general-purpose vehicles that earlier assessments had dismissed. But they were everywhere. Reconnaissance patrols in jeeps moved faster than German motorcycle units. American artillery repositioned using jeeps as tow vehicles, achieving mobility that German doctrine said required half-tracks. Supply columns stretched for miles, and those small vehicles hauled loads that should have required trucks. In December 1942, German forces captured several jeeps intact near Taburba. Von Arnim ordered immediate technical analysis. The report that reached his desk confused rather than clarified. The vehicles were exactly as photographed, lightweight, simple, with minimal protection. But they worked. They had crossed hundreds of miles of desert. They had operated in sandstorms that immobilized German equipment. Their engines showed wear but remained functional. Across the Mediterranean, similar scenes unfolded. When Allied forces invaded Sicily in July 1943, jeeps drove off landing craft directly onto beaches. German defenders had prepared for tanks and heavy vehicles. They watched in confusion as these small vehicles navigated terrain the Wehrmacht considered impassable. Sicilian hills and mountain roads had narrow turns and steep grades. German vehicles required careful navigation. Jeeps simply climbed. Sergeant Frank Kurt's 1st Infantry Division drove a jeep hauling a 37mm anti-tank gun up a mountainside outside Troina. The road, if it could be called that, was a goat path barely wide enough for the vehicle. The grade exceeded 30 degrees in places. German positions above assumed no vehicles could reach them. Kurtz's jeep not only made the climb, but positioned the gun for fire support that broke the defensive position. In Italy, the jeep proved its worth in mountains where German planners insisted mechanized warfare was impossible. At Monte Cassino, jeeps transported supplies to forward positions along roads that were barely trails. They evacuated wounded from aid stations that trucks couldn't reach. They carried ammunition to artillery positions on slopes where horses struggled. Lieutenant Hans Werner, captured near Anzio in January 1944, told his interrogators something remarkable. His unit had orders to destroy American supply vehicles, but they'd been instructed to capture jeeps intact whenever possible. The Wehrmacht had begun using captured jeeps because their own vehicles couldn't match the performance. German forces had started the war with superior equipment and doctrine. They'd conquered most of Europe using carefully engineered vehicles designed for specific purposes, and now their soldiers were requesting American vehicles that violated every principle of German military engineering. But North Africa and Italy were sideshows. The real test was coming, and when it arrived, the jeep would prove that mobility wasn't just an advantage, it was the difference between victory and defeat. June 6, 1944, Normandy, France. In the first 24 hours of D-Day, Allied forces landed 156,000 troops on French beaches. Those troops brought thousands of jeeps with them, packed into landing craft, waterproofed for the crossing, driven directly onto the beaches under fire. Within weeks, tens of thousands of jeeps were operating in France. By autumn, as Allied armies broke out from the bocage and raced across France toward Germany, the number exceeded 70,000. These numbers require perspective. The the entire German Army Group B, defending France under Field Marshal Rommel, struggled with chronic vehicle shortages. The Allies deployed more light utility vehicles than German forces could field across the entire theatre, a level of motorized mobility that Wehrmacht planners had never anticipated facing. General Lieutenant Fritz Bayerlein, commanding the Panzer Lehr Division, watched the Allied breakout from defensive positions near St-Lô. His report to headquarters captured the mechanical reality. The American columns move with speeds we cannot match. Their reconnaissance vehicles are everywhere, reporting our positions before we can react. Their artillery relocates constantly, preventing effective counter-battery fire. We are fighting not an army, but a motorized civilization. The Jeep-enabled tactics German forces couldn't counter. American reconnaissance units in Jeeps ranged miles ahead of main forces, identifying German positions and calling in artillery or airstrikes before German commanders knew they'd been spotted. When German forces attempted to establish defensive lines, American artillery would arrive within hours, towed by Jeeps that could navigate roads German vehicles couldn't use. Staff Sergeant Curtis Culin, 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron, drove a Jeep equipped with a welded steel cutting blade that could break through the infamous Norman hedgerows. His unit discovered that these ancient earthen barriers, which channeled German defensive fire and slowed American armor, were no obstacle to a Jeep with the right modification. Within days, welding shops were producing hedge-cutting blades, and Jeeps were creating paths through terrain that was supposed to be impassable. The Red Ball Express, the massive supply operation that kept Allied armies supplied during the race across France, depended on Jeeps as traffic directors, maintenance vehicles, and communication links. While 2.5-ton trucks hauled the bulk cargo, Jeeps escorted convoys, directed traffic at intersections, and responded to breakdowns. The roughly 75% African-American Red Ball workforce used Jeeps to maintain the continuous flow of supplies that sustained the advance. Corporal John L. Houston drove a Jeep for the Red Ball Express for 117 consecutive days without a day off. His vehicle transported repair crews, delivered urgent spare parts, and evacuated sick drivers. He calculated that his Jeep traveled more than 20,000 miles between June and October 1944, roughly the distance from Paris to Tokyo. The vehicle required constant maintenance and several major repairs, but it kept running, kept moving, kept the supplies flowing forward. German forces attempted to counter the Jeep's mobility by targeting them specifically. Luftwaffe pilots received orders to strafe American vehicle columns with priority on small reconnaissance vehicles. But by late 1944, Allied air superiority made these attacks suicide missions. German soldiers resorted to using captured Jeeps, painting them with Wehrmacht markings. Allied forces learned to be suspicious of any Jeep operating alone near German lines. It might be crewed by German soldiers in American uniforms. The Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 provided the ultimate test. German forces launched a massive counter-offensive through the Ardennes forest, achieving complete tactical surprise. In the first days, Wehrmacht units penetrated deep into Allied lines, capturing supplies and creating chaos. But the German advance ran on captured American fuel. Their own supply lines couldn't keep pace. American forces, falling back, used Jeeps to maintain communication and coordinate defensive positions. When the 101st Airborne Division became surrounded at Bastogne, Jeeps were among the last vehicles to evacuate wounded before German forces completed the encirclement. And when General Patton's Third Army turned north to relieve Bastogne, his forward units traveled in Jeeps that navigated icy roads German vehicles couldn't traverse. By January 1945, when the Bulge was contained, German forces had burned through their offensive capability. They'd advanced far but couldn't sustain the logistics necessary for victory. American forces, supplied by an unending stream of trucks and Jeeps, simply absorbed the blow and counterattacked. A captured German major, interrogated after his surrender in January, was asked what surprised him most about American military capabilities. His answer was immediate. Your logistics. We calculated your supply lines would collapse. They expanded. The Jeep was visible proof of that expansion, and as Allied armies crossed into Germany itself, German soldiers would see just how thoroughly their assessments had failed. April 1945. Western Germany. As Allied forces pushed deeper into Germany, captured Wehrmacht officers witnessed scenes that shattered their understanding of modern warfare. American military traffic moved past prisoner compounds in endless streams. Officers who had spent careers studying logistics watched in professional despair as the reality of American industrial capacity rolled before their eyes. One captured German staff officer, watching jeeps pass his holding area for hours, asked his interrogator a simple question. How many of these vehicles did America produce? When told the number exceeded 640,000, the officer sat in silence. The figure was incomprehensible. That was more vehicles of a single type than Germany's entire Wehrmacht had possessed at the war's beginning. The mathematics were inescapable. Germany had fought a war of careful resource management, specialized equipment, and efficient production. America had fought a war of overwhelming abundance. The Jeep was merely the most visible symbol of an industrial capacity that German planners never believed possible. Post-war surveys of German military leadership revealed a consistent pattern. When asked what surprised them most about American military capability, German officers didn't cite superior tactics or better training. They cited logistics, the ability to move armies across continents, supplied continuously, supported by equipment that worked in every climate and terrain. General Oberst Alfred Jodl, Wehrmacht Chief of Operations Staff, testified at Nuremberg that German strategic planning assumed American industrial production would require years to convert to war production. We calculated, he stated, that America would need until 1944 to achieve full military mobilization. We were wrong. They achieved it by 1943 and at scales we believed impossible. The Jeep's production statistics supported his statement. From 0 vehicles in 1940 to 647,1925 by war's end, peak production of 700 per day, a vehicle every 2 minutes, round the clock, for years. But numbers alone don't capture the Jeep's impact. Its real success was qualitative. It changed how armies moved and fought. It enabled tactics that wouldn't have been possible with conventional military vehicles. It gave infantry mobility, artillery flexibility, and commanders real-time communication and reconnaissance. General Major Wilhelm Ritter von Thoma, captured in North Africa and held as a POW in Britain, had his conversations secretly recorded by British intelligence. In one conversation with a fellow prisoner, he discussed American military equipment. Their vehicle, the Jeep, it is not better engineered than our Kübelwagen, but they produced hundreds for every one of ours. They gave their soldiers tools to win through abundance rather than superiority. And abundance, it turns out, is its own form of superiority. The Jeep's versatility meant American forces could adapt to any situation. When roads were blocked, Jeeps went cross-country. When bridges were destroyed, Jeeps found fords. When German forces attempted to interdict supply lines, the sheer number of vehicles meant some always got through. After the war, the US Army conducted studies on logistics effectiveness. They concluded that mobility, not firepower, was the decisive factor in the European campaign. American forces moved faster, repositioned quicker, and sustained operations longer than German forces because they had the vehicles to do so. The Jeep became so synonymous with American military power that foreign militaries immediately sought to acquire them. The Soviet Union received tens of thousands of Jeeps through Lend-Lease, part of more than 400,000 vehicles supplied to the USSR, and continued using them after the war. British forces, who had their own light vehicles, requested Jeeps because they outperformed domestic alternatives. French forces used jeeps extensively for light reconnaissance and liaison roles. May 8, 1945, Europe. The war in Europe ended not with a grand battle, but with signatures on surrender documents. Across the continent, German military leadership signed unconditional surrender. Among the countless vehicles moving through liberated Europe in those final days were tens of thousands of jeeps, still running, still serving, still proving their worth. The final accounting of the jeep's war production tells a story that transcends mere numbers. Total production, 647,925 vehicles. Service record, every theatre of war, every climate, every terrain type. Impact on the war effort, incalculable but undeniable. Mechanical reliability, higher than any comparable German vehicle. Post-war influence, the jeep's descendants served in military roles for decades, with successor vehicles based on its design principles continuing into the 1980s and beyond. But these statistics, impressive as they are, miss the deeper lesson. The Jeep succeeded because it embodied American industrial philosophy. It was simple rather than sophisticated. It was adaptable rather than specialized. It was produced through collaboration between competitors rather than controlled by central planning. It was assembled by a diverse workforce that included women, African Americans, and others whom Nazi ideology dismissed as inferior. The German military entered the war believing in the superiority of specialized equipment, careful engineering, and ideological purity. They built the Kübelwagen as a specialized reconnaissance vehicle, designed by experts, produced by German workers of acceptable racial background. It was a good vehicle, but there were never enough of them. America built the Jeep through chaos and compromise. 3 companies competed and collaborated. Designs were stolen and shared. Workers who couldn't get factory jobs before the war became essential to production. The vehicle that emerged wasn't perfect. It was too light, too exposed, too simple. But there were 647 schon 125 of them. History's verdict is clear. Wars are won not by the best equipment, but by adequate equipment in overwhelming quantities. They're won by logistics systems that can sustain operations across continents. They're won by industrial bases that can transform overnight, from producing automobiles to producing war machines. They're won by societies that can mobilize every citizen, regardless of gender or race, toward victory. The Jeep proved that democratic chaos produces better outcomes than totalitarian order. It demonstrated that practical solutions beat ideological purity. It showed that abundance is a quality all its own. In the decades after the war, the Jeep became a cultural icon. It appeared in movies and advertisements. It evolved into civilian vehicles. It gave its name to an entire category of automobiles. But for those who fought in World War II, the Jeep remained something more fundamental, the vehicle that won the war. When asked decades later what single piece of equipment proved most valuable in Europe, General Dwight Eisenhower didn't name tanks or aircraft. He listed 4 items: the Dakota transport plane, the 2.5-ton truck, the bulldozer, and the Jeep. The vehicle German analysts had laughed at in 1942 earned placement alongside the weapons that defeated Nazi Germany. Oberst Klaus Hartmann survived the war and returned to Germany. In the years that followed, when asked about wartime intelligence assessments, he acknowledged the profound miscalculation. German analysts had seen the photographs, read the specifications, and dismissed the vehicle based on ideology rather than evidence. They had watched these vehicles multiply across every front, captured them and used them themselves, yet never adjusted their strategic thinking to account for what American production capacity actually meant. They fought the war they expected instead of the war they faced. The sound of Jeep engines became the soundtrack of Allied victory. From North African deserts to Italian mountains, from Norman beaches to German autobahns, that distinctive 4-cylinder whine announced American presence and American power. German soldiers learned to recognize it, to fear it, to request capture rather than face the armies it supplied. And in factories across America, workers kept building them, 700 per day, every 2 minutes, round the clock, month after month, year after year, until the war was won. The German analysts who laughed at the toy Jeep learned a lesson that extends beyond military history. They learned that ideology blinds us to reality, that assumptions about what's possible are often wrong, that simplicity can triumph over sophistication, that democracy's messy improvisation produces results totalitarian efficiency cannot match. The Jeep was never the best vehicle in any single category, but it was good enough in every category that mattered, and there were 647,925 of them. That, ultimately, is how wars are won.